The leather strap tore through the morning air, sharp as an iron door slamming shut, and Marlo Kessler went down onto the rain-slicked brick, her canvas apron touching the pavement before her knees did. Nobody moved. Not the police captain standing 15 paces off with a paper cup of coffee in his hand. Not the 20 shopkeepers watching from behind windows fogged with steam, 24 pairs of eyes, and not one door opened. Her crime, in this market district, was having once married a man who now lay in the ground and was no longer around to answer for the numbers carrying his name. Again, Hollis Pryor said, his voice as flat as a man reading off a price list, and the man beside him raised his arm. Then a voice cut through the drizzle. Not loud, low and slow, almost calm. She doesn't owe anybody anything. Every head turned toward the end of the alley, where under the dripping awning of the old instrument shop, a man stood leaning against the open door of a black sedan, charcoal wool coat, hands in his pockets, no rings, no chains, nothing but a scratched face watch on his left wrist. He didn't hurry. He didn't even step out from under the awning, but the raised arm came down halfway. He looked at that man, then down at the woman digging her fingers into the seam between the bricks to keep from going all the way down, and his eyes stayed there a beat longer than they should have. "You touch her again," he said, "and you answer to me." The alley went dead quiet. Nothing left but water dripping off the tin roof into a metal trash can. Pryor turned his head and narrowed his eyes toward the awning with the look of a man trying to place a face from some fundraiser. And because he couldn't place it, he smiled the most expensive mistake of his life. Marlo lifted her head, hair stuck to her cheek, and something stirred in the back of her mind, like a name sitting on the tip of her tongue that wouldn't come. She had heard that voice before, a long time ago, on a night she had forgotten. Nobody in the river market knew that man's name, but before the sun went down that day, all of Kansas City would, and 19 families on that street would finally understand that what they had been calling fate, all these years, was nothing but a forged signature, written with a gold-capped fountain pen. If this story has held you this far, leave a like, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel to walk the rest of the road with Marlo. 2 days earlier, while the sky above River Market still hadn't decided whether it meant to brighten or remain dark, Marlo Kessler stood before the blue-painted wooden door of the copper kettle with the familiar ring of keys in her hand. That key had been worn so smooth that its teeth were barely visible anymore, because it was the same key her mother had used for nearly 30 years, and Marlo had never once thought about having a new one made. The lock gave its familiar dry click. Inside, the air still held the scent of the previous afternoon, a scent she could have recognized among hundreds of others in the world. The smell of dark roasted coffee beans mingled with old oak and the faint sweetness of milk lingering on the steam wand. She turned on the lights. Golden light spilled over the row of high stools, across the wooden counter polished glossy by countless elbows resting there through the years, and over the copper espresso machine, standing proudly at the corner of the counter, like an old watchman who had been there since before she had learned to walk. Marlo hung her coat on a hook, tied the canvas apron around her waist, and brushed her hand once over the corner where her mother's name had been embroidered in red thread now faded with age. It was a habit. She did it every morning without ever realizing she was doing it. She poured beans into the grinder, and its sharp whine shattered the silence of the room. The smell of freshly ground coffee burst into the air, warm and rich, filling the entire shop within a few breaths. She turned the steam valve. The copper machine shuddered once, then began to breathe, producing the steady, comforting sound she had known since she was a little girl, sitting on a tall stool and watching her mother work. Marlo reached for a stack of paper cups, picked up a pen, and began writing names on each one. She didn't need a notebook. Mr. Halverson from the shoe shop. Black coffee, no sugar, always before daylight. Miss Delaney from the flower shop. Almond milk, with a little extra cinnamon. Mr. Otis Brantley from the bakery across the street. Wheat coffee, 2 sugars, and it always had to be served in a ceramic mug with a handle instead of a paper cup, because he insisted that coffee drunk from paper wasn't coffee anymore. Mrs. Nadine Foss from the credit union at the end of the block. A small cup, plenty of milk foam, not much coffee because, as she liked to say, her heart wasn't young anymore. She wrote each name in quick, rounded letters, and as she did, she realized that she had memorized the habits of an entire street without ever once trying to remember them. The bell above the door chimed. Toby came in with a backpack over one shoulder, his brown hair sticking straight up because he hadn't had time to comb it, and he immediately lifted both hands and waved them in front of his sister in a greeting that only the two of them understood. Marlowe smiled and answered with the exact same gesture. Toby dropped his backpack beside the corner table, the one pressed against the window that he had long ago decided belonged to him, then pulled out a stack of paper and a box of colored pencils. Marlowe poured him a glass of warm milk, set it down, then signed with her hands to ask whether he wanted to listen to the machine sing. Toby nodded eagerly. She led him closer to the counter, took his small hand, and pressed it against the warm copper body of the machine before opening the steam valve. The machine began to tremble. Toby's eyes widened, and the smile across his face bloomed as though someone had suddenly switched on a light inside him. The boy listened with his hands. Toby's world entered through his eyes and through the vibrations traveling across his skin, and the deep, muffled hum of that copper machine was his favorite of all the vibrations he had ever touched. He ran back to the table, picked up a blue-colored pencil, and began to draw. He drew sound as circles, one layered over another, some large, some small, spreading outward from a single point in the center of the page. Marlowe stood looking over his shoulder for a long moment, still holding a cleaning cloth in one hand, and she thought there wasn't anyone in the world who could draw sound more beautifully than that boy. Mrs. Brantley pushed open the door after the morning had fully brightened, carrying a basket of bread her husband had just taken from the oven, and she asked Toby whether he wanted to come across the street and help her arrange the loaves. Toby nodded, hurriedly gathered up his papers, ran over to hug his sister, then followed Mrs. Brantley toward the door. Marlowe stood on the front step and watched the two figures cross the damp, mist-covered street until the bakery door closed behind them. Then she went back inside. On the counter, beside the tin tip box, lay a white envelope with the hospital's name printed in the upper left corner. It had been sitting there since the previous afternoon. Marlowe looked at it, wiped her hands on her apron, reached toward it, then drew her hand back. She knew what was written inside. She just didn't know what she was going to do about it. She pushed the envelope farther beneath the order ledger, as though hiding it from sight might somehow push the deadline inside it back by a few more days. The bell above the door sounded again, but this time there was no familiar gentle chime, only the hard sound of the door being shoved open until it struck the wall. Marlowe looked up. A silver-haired man with his hair combed straight back was walking into her shop without knocking, without greeting her, heading directly toward the counter as though the place had belonged to him for years. The man wore a camel-colored cashmere coat, untouched by a single drop of morning mist, and his silver hair was combed back so neatly that he looked as though he had just stepped out of a boardroom, rather than in from the wet street outside. He set a thick stack of papers on the wooden counter, fastened together with a gleaming metal clip. Marlowe was still holding the cleaning cloth in one hand. She hadn't said anything yet. The man reached into the inside pocket of his coat and took out a fountain pen with a gold cap. He removed the cap, put it back on, then began slowly turning the pen between two fingers the way someone might roll an unlit cigarette. He said his name was Hollis Pryor, and he said it with the voice of a man accustomed to having the name itself finish whatever work remained to be done. Marlowe knew that name. Everyone on the block knew that name, in the way people knew the name of a storm that had passed through somewhere else. He swept his eyes around the shop, looking up at the ceiling, down at the wooden floor, then toward the copper espresso machine in the corner. His gaze lingered there longer than anywhere else, not with admiration, but with the look of someone studying an object that was waiting to be appraised. Then he pushed the stack of papers toward her. He said the entire block fell within the boundaries of an approved riverfront development project, that 18 businesses along the street had signed transfer agreements and accepted payment, that the investors required every property to be contiguous without a single gap, and that the copper kettle was the last one remaining. He said all of it calmly, as though he were reading the weather forecast. Marlowe asked if he had come to buy her shop. Pryor shook his head. He said he hadn't come to buy it. He had come to collect. Then he opened the stack to the first page and turned it around so she could see. Marlowe lowered her eyes. On the page was a private loan agreement, and the number printed across the middle was so large that she had to read it a second time before she could believe what she was seeing. At the bottom, beneath the line marked borrower, was Shane Doyle's signature. The hand holding the cloth suddenly went cold. She said her husband would never have borrowed a single dollar from anyone without telling her, and she said it slowly, as though she were trying to convince herself rather than the man standing across from her. Pryor tapped the tip of the pen against the counter exactly once. He said people usually didn't tell their wives about the debts they were ashamed of. Marlowe lifted her head and looked him directly in the face. She said her husband was dead. She said he had been lying in the cemetery north of the city since spring, that she had chosen his headstone with her own hands, that the entire neighborhood had been there that day. Pryor didn't blink. He capped the pen, slipped it back into his inside pocket, and said that people died, but money didn't. There was no cruelty in his voice, no raised volume, and that was precisely what sent a chill across the back of Marlowe's neck. Then he tapped one finger against the stack of papers and said her husband had signed, that he had the signature in his possession, and that she had 2 days. He said that if the money wasn't there when those 2 days were over, then this building, this shop, and everything inside it would pass into his name exactly as written on the final page. Marlowe asked why 2 days. Pryor smiled for the first time since entering the shop and said his investors didn't like waiting, and neither did he. He turned away and walked toward the door, then paused for a moment on the front step without looking back. He said the coffee smelled good in here, truly good, and that he would miss the smell when it was gone. Then the door closed, and the bell gave its gentle chime as though an ordinary customer had just left. Marlowe remained standing there for a very long time. She poured herself a glass of water and didn't drink it. She served customers throughout the entire morning with the stack of papers lying silent beneath the counter like a sleeping animal. It wasn't until night, when the door had been locked, the chairs had been turned upside down on the tables, and the only light from the street outside came through the glass in pale bands, that she finally pulled the papers out beneath the counter lamp. She read every line, slowly, tracing each word with her fingertip like a blind person feeling for the way forward. Then she stood, went upstairs to the small room on the second floor, opened the bottom drawer of a cabinet, and took out a tin box filled with documents. She carried it downstairs, placed it beside the loan agreement, and pulled out the death certificate. She laid the 2 papers side by side beneath the light. She looked at the date on the death certificate. Then she looked at the date written beneath the signature. Then she looked again, and again, until her hand began trembling so badly that the paper made a soft rustling sound in the stillness of the empty shop. The name on the contract had been signed on a day when the man who supposedly signed it had already been in the ground for nearly 2 weeks. The next morning, Marlowe didn't open the shop. She hung the small wooden sign that said, "Back soon," against the glass, something she hadn't used once in the 3 years since her mother died, then tucked the stack of papers under one arm and walked along the street toward the end of the block. The damp chill of the night still clung to the brick pavement. She passed Miss Delaney's flower shop as Delaney was carrying displays out onto the sidewalk, passed the instrument repair shop with its rolling door only halfway raised, and nodded to each person out of habit without stopping. The community credit union occupied the corner building, a 2-story red brick structure with a thick glass door and an opening bell that had been broken for years. Mrs. Nadine Foss sat behind the counter, her glasses resting low on the bridge of her nose, a stack of transaction slips in front of her and a small cup of coffee that Marlowe knew for certain had come from somewhere else, because her own shop hadn't opened that morning. Nadine looked up and smiled. The familiar smile of a woman who had occupied that chair longer than most of the customers waiting in line had been alive. Marlowe placed the loan agreement on the counter, pushed it toward her, and said she needed Nadine to look at something. She said there was something very wrong with those papers. Nadine lifted her glasses into place. She drew the stack closer and turned to the final page, where the signature sat along the bottom line. She looked down at it. Marlowe stood on the other side of the counter, with both hands gripping the wooden edge, waiting. Mrs. Nadine didn't read anything. She simply stared at that signature for the length of 4 breaths, no longer, then removed her glasses, folded the arms together, and pushed the papers back toward Marlowe. She said the documents were valid. She said she couldn't help her. Marlowe didn't understand. She pulled the papers back, took out the death certificate she had already tucked between the pages, laid the 2 documents side by side on the counter, and pointed to the 2 dates. She said Nadine only had to look right there, just once, that this man had no longer been alive on the day his name was written there. Nadine bent down and looked. She reached out as though she meant to pick up the paper, but instead her hand brushed against the pen lying beside the stack of transaction slips. She picked it up and unconsciously rolled the cap between 2 fingers, and Marlowe saw the faint tremor in her fingertips. Only a little, the kind of trembling an older person might have on a cold morning. Nadine set the pen down. She said verifying signatures wasn't within the credit union's authority, that Marlowe should find a lawyer, that she was very sorry. She said the words "very sorry" in a voice noticeably softer than everything that had come before. Then she turned to the customer waiting behind Marlowe and asked what he needed. And that was how the conversation ended. No door slammed. No one raised a voice. Nadine simply stopped looking at her. Marlowe gathered the papers and stepped outside. The sun had begun to rise, but it still wasn't warm enough to matter. She crossed the street and went straight to Otis Brantley's bakery opposite her own shop. the place whose smell of baking dough had been woven into every morning of her life for more years than she could count. She knocked on the door. She heard footsteps inside, then the turn of a lock, and the door opened exactly halfway. Otis stood there with flour still clinging to his hands, his white apron marked with dark, scorch stains near the hem. And when he saw her face, he didn't ask a single question. He already knew. The whole block had probably known since the previous afternoon. His lips moved as though he meant to say something. His eyes dropped from her face to the stack of papers in her hands, then rose again, and at that exact moment, a telephone began ringing somewhere inside. The old-fashioned ring of a wall-mounted landline. Otis turned his head toward the sound. Then he looked back at her. Then he began closing the door. He said he was sorry. He said Pryor had the papers on his place too, Marlowe. He said it through the narrowing gap. And she caught one last glimpse of his eyes before the lock turned again from the inside. The telephone kept ringing. Then it stopped. Marlowe stood in the middle of the street for a while, with the papers held against her chest, then slowly turned and looked both ways along the block. Miss Delaney's flower shop had lowered its shade halfway. The rolling door of the instrument repair shop was coming down with a slow metallic clatter. At the far end of the street, someone had just flipped the sign in a window from open to closed, even though the morning had barely begun. No one said a word to her. No one needed to. The entire street was slowly closing around her, one door at a time, silent as a hand curling itself into a fist. The neighborhood police station stood 3 blocks from the market. A low concrete building with narrow windows and a rain-soaked flag hanging limp from the pole in the yard. Marlowe pushed through the door, crossed past the front desk, and when she gave the name of the person she needed to see, the young officer sitting there merely jerked his chin toward the end of the hallway, without bothering to ask why she had come. Captain Dale Renner's office had a frosted glass door and a tarnished brass nameplate. Inside, he was leaning back in his chair with half a sandwich still in one hand and a stack of reports lying face down on the desk. He was the kind of man around 50 whose sharp edges had all been worn away by time, leaving behind a broad, mild face that made it difficult to think of him as someone you needed to be wary of. Marlowe didn't say hello. She walked straight to the desk and set the stack of documents down on the glass surface harder than she intended, and the slap of paper against the desk made the coffee cup beside it tremble slightly. She said she needed to report a forged document. She turned the stack to the last page, pressed one finger against the signature line, then pulled out the death certificate and placed it beside the contract, pressing her finger against the date printed there. She said he only had to look at those 2 dates. Just look, and he would understand. Renner stopped chewing. He set the sandwich down on its napkin, wiped his hands, then pulled the documents toward himself. He didn't pick them up. He only bent forward and studied them with both hands resting on the desk, and he looked for much longer than Marlowe had expected. Then he raised his head and asked a question she hadn't anticipated. He asked whether the document was an original or a copy. Marlowe said it was the one Pryor had brought to the shop and left behind. Renner nodded slowly. He let out a long breath through his nose, the kind of breath a man gave after mentally checking a list and finding everything exactly where it was supposed to be. He nodded a few more times. Then he rested his elbows on the desk, leaned forward slightly, and his voice shifted into the neighborly tone of someone asking after the family. He said he had known her husband, only a little, and that Shane had been a man who knew how to think things through. Then he asked whether Shane had ever left any papers at home, ledgers, notes, anything like that. The sort of thing people tucked into a drawer and forgot about. Marlowe hesitated for a beat. She said no. She said he had left carrying exactly 1 bag and had left behind an entire closet of clothes, that she had cleared all of it out long ago, that there hadn't been any ledgers. Renner looked at her for another second, then smiled, a warm and tired smile, and said never mind. He had only asked in case. He pulled open the drawer on the right side of his desk, placed both the contract and the death certificate inside, pushed the drawer closed, then took the ring of keys from his belt and locked it right in front of her. Marlowe asked what he was doing. Renner said he would have someone look into it, that these things took time, that she should go home and not do anything foolish. She asked how much time, because she only had 1 day left. Renner shrugged and said the law didn't run on anyone else's schedule. Then he picked up his sandwich and took another bite, and Marlowe understood that the conversation was over. She walked out of the station with both hands empty, and it wasn't until she was standing on the sidewalk that she realized she had just left the only evidence she possessed inside a locked drawer to which she had no key. That afternoon, she went to a small law office on the 2nd floor of an old building near the bus station, where a plastic sign bore the name Perry Odom and the words Affordable Civil Consultation. Mr. Odom was around 60, wearing a shirt a little too loose for him, and he had the patient air of a man accustomed to hearing terrible stories in small rooms. He poured her a glass of water and listened while she told him everything from beginning to end, without interrupting her once. He took notes. He asked a few questions about dates, about who currently had possession of the documents, and he frowned when she told him about the locked drawer. He said there were grounds for a case, that the court could be asked to order a handwriting examination, and that she shouldn't sign anything else. Marlowe opened her wallet and counted out everything she had left, bills and coins together, most of it the week's tips, and placed all of it on his desk. Mr. Odom picked up his pen and asked for the full name of the person whose signature appeared on the contract, so he could enter it into the file. She gave him her husband's name. She said the last name, too. Mr. Odom's pen stopped halfway across the page. He looked up at her, and for one very brief moment his face went pale, the particular kind of pale that came over someone who had just heard the name of an illness they had once suffered themselves. He set the pen down. He said he needed to review a few things, that he needed until the following morning, that she should leave the money there and come back in the morning, and he would have a plan for her. He stood and walked her all the way to the stairs, something he hadn't done when she arrived. The next morning, Marlowe climbed to the second floor of that building before the day had warmed. A sheet of white paper had been taped to the glass door, handwritten in marker with only a few words, saying that the office was temporarily closed, with no reopening date scheduled. Every light inside had been turned off. She stood there and knocked 3 times, and no one answered. She walked for the entire afternoon, not because she had anywhere to go, but because sitting still felt worse, and by the time she returned to the market district, it was well past midnight. The street was almost completely dark, with only 2 streetlights still burning and a stray cat sitting on the lid of a trash can, watching her as she passed. She went around to the back, where there was a blue-painted steel door her mother used to leave open at closing time, so the heat from the kitchen could escape. She hadn't even taken out her key when she stopped. The door was ajar, not wide open, only a finger's width, and around the lock were fresh scratches that still gleamed against the paint. The metal pried and bent to one side like a twisted mouth. Marlowe stood perfectly still for a long time, listening. There wasn't a sound inside. She pushed the door open and switched on the lights. The shop looked as though someone had gone through it with both hands. 3 high stools lay overturned on the floor. The mat in front of the counter had been kicked crooked, and the cabinet door beneath the counter hung wide open. The drawer where she kept the order ledger had been pulled out as far as it would go, and everything inside had been dumped across the counter. Invoices, pens, paper clips, old photographs she had stored there so long ago she could barely remember doing it. The small refrigerator had been opened, its door still hanging ajar with the light inside still glowing. Even the tins of cocoa powder on the shelf had been opened. Marlowe moved around the shop with one hand gripping the edge of the counter, searching for the thing anyone would have searched for in a moment like that. The cash register was still exactly where she had left it. She opened it. The money was still inside, arranged in the same order she had left it that afternoon. She turned toward the tin tip box beside the sugar jar, the box any child passing by could have reached into and emptied. It was untouched. She opened the lid and poured the contents onto the counter, then counted everything from the beginning. Not a single cent was missing. She counted a second time, because she couldn't believe it. Then a third. Then she lowered herself to the floor, leaned her back against the cabinet beneath the counter, stretched her legs out among the scattered invoices, and counted it all for a 4th time beneath the yellow lights of the empty shop, the coins cold in the palm of her hand. Someone had forced their way through that door in the middle of the night, searched every drawer, opened even the cocoa tins on the shelf, and then walked away without taking a single dollar. Marlowe sat there for a very long time with that thought in her head, unable to push it away. She thought about calling the police, and the instant the thought appeared, she heard again the sound of the drawer in Captain Renner's office closing, and the key turning once in the lock. It wasn't that this neighborhood had no law. The law here had an owner, and its owner had drunk coffee in her shop the morning before. She sat on the floor until her legs went numb. Then she stood, set each stool upright, gathered the invoices and stacked them neatly, closed the refrigerator door, and wedged a temporary pin into the damaged lock. She wiped the counter twice, even though it wasn't dirty, because her hands needed something to do. Then she stopped in front of the copper espresso machine at the corner of the counter. She stood looking at it for a long time. The body of the machine was still faintly warm from the afternoon, its copper dark and glossy where human hands had touched it most often over 30 years. It was the only thing she had left of her mother. It was also the only thing in the shop still worth any real amount of money. Marlowe raised her hand and placed her palm against the body of the machine, on the exact spot where she had placed Toby's hand the morning before, and she stood there like that for a very long time. Then she took her phone from the pocket of her apron. She stepped back 2 paces, so the whole machine would fit into the frame. She took a photograph. She looked at the image on the screen, her eyes burning, then opened the city's classified listings, uploaded the picture, and typed a short line into the description box saying that it was an old espresso machine, still worked well, needed to sell quickly, price negotiable. Her finger hovered over the post button for a long time before she finally pressed it. If you've stayed with Marlo all the way to this night, please leave a like and a comment for her. It means more than you might think. That morning, while Marlo was wiping down the counter for the 3rd time and trying not to look toward the copper machine in the corner, a black sedan entered the street from the far end. It moved slowly, far more slowly than normal. Slowly enough that a shopkeeper stacking crates on the sidewalk looked up to watch it pass. The car wasn't new. Its paint had faded toward the gray of many rainy seasons. Mud clung to the tires, and there was nothing about it that should have made anyone look twice. It passed the flower shop, past the instrument repair shop, and when it reached the wooden sign carved with the words, "Copper Kettle," it slowed for another beat. It had always done that, a few times every month, for several years now. That car had passed along this street in the early morning, slowing at that exact spot before continuing toward the bridge and disappearing. No one in the market district paid attention. No one had any reason to. But that morning, for the first time, it didn't keep going. It pulled close to the curb and came to a complete stop. The man behind the wheel was somewhere in his 30s, broad-shouldered, with short black hair and a charcoal wool coat. He turned off the engine but didn't get out right away. He sat motionless behind the wheel, looking through the glass toward the blue-painted wooden door and the window clouded with steam. And inside his mind was something he had carried for years without ever telling anyone. One winter night long ago, the wind had cut through the alley behind the market so sharply that it felt like blades against the skin, and he had dragged himself into that alley with one side of his body soaked through and nowhere else left to go. The back door of a small shop had opened, spilling a strip of yellow light across the bricks. A young woman stood there with a cleaning cloth in her hand. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't call anyone. She went inside and came back with a clean towel and a cup of hot coffee, set both on the step beside him, and said that the door would be locked in 40 minutes. Then she went back inside and continued cleaning as though there were no one outside at all. The man in the car opened the door and stepped out. The bell chimed when he pushed his way into the shop. Inside, there were only 2 customers seated at the row of tables in the middle, and a young woman behind the counter rearranging a stack of cups. He didn't go to the counter. He walked straight to the corner table beside the window, sat down, and placed both hands on the tabletop. Marlo looked up, nodded in greeting out of habit, and brought him the small menu she already knew he wouldn't open. He ordered a black coffee. She turned away, and while she waited for the water to run, she glanced back toward the corner once. The man sat very straight, not looking at his phone, not looking out the window, only staring at the tabletop in front of him. There was something in the way he sat that reminded her of the rare customers who used to come into her mother's shop close to closing time. The ones her mother had always told her not to question, because sometimes all a person needed was something warm poured into a cup. Marlo reached for a plate, set the coffee on it, then paused for a beat, opened the display case, took out the last slice of apple pie left from the previous afternoon, and placed it beside the cup. She carried the plate to the corner table and set it down. He looked up at the pie. She said it was on the house, no charge, then added that he looked like he hadn't eaten anything since yesterday. Then she turned away, went back behind the counter, and didn't say anything else. The man didn't touch the coffee. He stared at the plate for a long time, long enough for the steam rising from the cup to disappear completely. Then he picked up the fork, finished the entire slice of pie, drank all the coffee, left an amount of money on the table many times greater than the bill, and walked outside without looking toward the counter. At the car, the passenger door opened, and a hunched, shouldered man already seated inside looked up from the phone in his hand and waited. His name was Rune Vasquez, and he had been following this man long enough to know that when his boss was silent, it was best not to ask questions. Gideon Falco walked around to the driver's side, got in, closed the door, and didn't start the engine right away. He looked through the windshield one last time toward the window fogged with steam, where the silhouette of the woman inside was bent over the counter, wiping it clean. Then, without turning his head, he said in a calm voice, as though reading a number from a ledger, that he wanted everything there was to know about Hollis Pryor, and he wanted it before the following morning. That afternoon, 3 men walked into Otis Brantley's bakery. They didn't buy anything. One stood directly in front of the entrance. Another went around behind the counter and looked into the kitchen, while the third rested one elbow on the glass pastry case and spoke to Otis for a long time in a quiet voice. No one raised his voice. No one touched him. But after they left, Otis stood alone in the middle of the bakery with flour still clinging to both hands, unable for a long time to lift the tray of bread from the counter. And that evening he closed the shop 2 hours earlier than usual. What they had told him was simple. They had heard he was thinking about testifying for the woman who owned the coffee shop across the street. That was somebody else's trouble. A man his age ought to think about his own shop first. Late that night, just after all 3 men walked out of their usual bar on the south side of the city, 2 cars pulled up against the curb, and none of them had time to understand what was happening. They were taken to an empty warehouse in the riverfront district, where the ceiling rose high overhead and every sound echoed back 2 or 3 times. Inside, there was only a long wooden table, 4 chairs, and a single light bulb hanging from a cord. The 3 men were told to sit down. No one tied them up. No one touched them. Rune Vasquez stood leaning against a steel column a few steps away with his arms folded across his chest, and he didn't say a word. The warehouse door creaked open, and Gideon Falco walked in. He didn't shout. He didn't ask anyone's name. He pulled out the remaining chair and sat across from the 3 men, removed the watch from his left wrist, the one whose crystal was covered in countless scratches, and placed it face up on the wooden table. Then he reached for the bottle of water waiting at the corner of the table, filled a glass, set the bottle down, and sat upright. He said the 3 of them had exactly as long as it took him to finish that glass of water to tell him who had sent them to the bakery. He said that after that, he wouldn't ask again. Then he raised the glass and took the first sip. There was no sound in the warehouse except water dripping from somewhere along the metal roof, and the breathing of the 3 men seated across from him. The man in the middle gave a short laugh and said he didn't understand what Gideon was talking about. Gideon didn't answer. He took a second sip. The water level in the glass dropped a little lower. The man on the left began glancing toward his friend. The man on the right began staring down at the tabletop. Gideon took a third sip, slowly, never taking his eyes off the 3 faces in front of him, and when he set the glass back on the wood, he did it so gently that it made almost no sound at all. Rune remained motionless beside the steel column. He had seen this scene a few times in his life, and he knew that the most frightening thing in the room wasn't what might happen next. It was the fact that the man sitting there showed no sign of being in a hurry. By the 4th sip, the man on the left gave up a name. By the 5th, all 3 were talking over one another, each of them trying to speak first, telling him who had paid them, who had given them the list of addresses, and who had instructed them that the old baker only needed a gentle reminder. Gideon finished the last sip, set the empty glass down, and remained silent for another moment. Then he picked up his watch, fastened it around his wrist again, and closed the clasp. He said there were 3 things he never changed. He didn't touch people who didn't owe him. He didn't touch children. And anyone who betrayed him got one chance to speak. Only one. He said those 3 things in the voice of a man reciting his own home address, then stood and walked toward the door. The 3 men were taken outside, and not one of them lost so much as a single hair from his head. In the car, after they had started toward the bridge, Rune finally asked what would have happened if they hadn't talked. Gideon looked out through the window as the bridge lights slid across his face in passing bands, and he said he would have drunk faster. When they arrived, he took out his phone and dialed a number Rune had given him that afternoon. It rang 3 times before someone answered. Gideon didn't give his name. He only said that by tomorrow morning, the man on the other end was going to take his hands off the coffee shop in River Market. There was a beat of silence. Then Hollis Pryor laughed, the easy, satisfied laugh of a man who had just heard an old joke. He said he didn't know who Gideon was and didn't care, that he had heard the same warning from more people than Gideon could imagine, and that if Gideon wanted to know where all of them were now, he was welcome to go find out for himself. Then he hung up. He set the phone down on his desk, rolled the pen between 2 fingers for a while, then dialed Wes Corrigan and told him to get men ready for the next morning, early, before that street had time to open. That night, Marlowe texted Mrs. Brantley and told her to let Toby sleep over, that there were a few things at the shop she needed to take care of. Mrs. Brantley wrote back that the boy was sitting at the kitchen table drawing and that he could stay as long as necessary. So while the sky was still dark, Toby remained fast asleep in the little room above the bakery, 1 brick wall away from the street, unaware of anything happening outside. Marlowe didn't sleep. She sat behind the counter all night with her phone lying in front of her, waiting for someone to message her about the espresso machine, and no one did. When the eastern sky had only just begun to lighten into a thin strip of gray, she heard a vehicle stop outside, then a car door closed. Then came the sound of the back door latch being forced open, because she had secured it temporarily with a pin, and that pin hadn't held anything at all. 4 men entered her shop before there was enough daylight for anyone to see another person's face clearly. The first was Wes Corrigan, a man around 40 with a flat, expressionless face, and the walk of someone who had done this so many times that there was no longer anything about it worth noticing. He didn't ask her a single question. He only said, "Mr. Pryor wanted to speak to her outside." Marlowe asked where the paperwork was, where the warrant was, and Corrigan looked at her the way a man might look at a chair that had been left in the wrong place. They took her through the back door, along the narrow alley running behind the row of buildings, and out into the brick courtyard between the rear of the coffee shop and the back of the old instrument store, the open space everyone in the market used for unloading deliveries in the morning. The night's rain had stopped, but the bricks were still glossy with water. Lights inside the shops began coming on one by one, and behind windows clouded with condensation, people began to stop and watch. Otis Brantley was inside his bakery, still holding a tray in his hands. He set it down. He walked toward the door. He raised one hand and wrapped it around the handle, holding it there, his fingers tightening and then loosening, and he stood like that for enough time for a man to live through an entire second lifetime inside his own head. Then he let his hand fall. Hollis Pryor stepped into the middle of the brick courtyard, slowly turning the gold-capped fountain pen between 2 fingers, and he spoke loudly enough for the whole block to hear, saying that anyone who still believed they could hide from a signature should watch carefully that morning. He said he wasn't taking anything from anyone. He was only collecting what had already been signed over. Then he turned toward Corrigan and gave a single nod. The leather strap cut through the morning air with a sharp crack, clean and sudden as an iron door slamming shut, and Marlowe Kessler crumpled onto the rain-wet bricks, the canvas of her apron striking the ground before her knees did. No one moved. Not the police captain standing 15 steps away with a paper cup of coffee in his hand. Not the 20 shopkeepers watching from behind windows fogged with steam. Then a voice came from the far end of the alley, and everything stopped. The man beneath the awning of the instrument shop stepped out from the shadows. And this time, he came forward for real. He didn't move quickly. He crossed the brick courtyard with both hands still inside the pockets of his coat, and there was something in the way he walked that made the 3 men standing near Corrigan shift aside without understanding why they were doing it. Corrigan turned completely around to face him. He said this was Pryor's business, and advised him to get the hell out. Gideon didn't answer. Corrigan shoved a hand inside his coat and pulled out a short metal object. His hand hadn't even risen all the way when that wrist was already trapped inside another hand, and Gideon twisted it once, sharply, in a direction the joint had never been designed to go. The metal object dropped onto the bricks with a dry clatter. Corrigan went down with it, his knees striking first, then his whole body collapsing sideways into a puddle of rainwater, gasping for breath and unable to move. The entire thing happened in the time it took an ordinary person to inhale and exhale once. The other 3 men stepped back. Then they stepped back again when, at the entrance to the alley, 4 car doors opened almost at the same time, and 4 men got out. None of them carried anything in their hands. None of them said a word. They simply stood across the exit and watched. Rune Vasquez was the last one out, his hands in his pockets, and he yawned as though someone had dragged him out of bed too early. Hollis Pryor stood rooted in the middle of the courtyard. The smile he had worn moments earlier was still hanging on his face like something someone had forgotten to remove. He looked around, at the 4 men blocking the alley, at the police captain slowly backing toward his patrol car, then at the man in the charcoal wool coat standing 3 steps away from him, and for the first time that morning, he couldn't think of a single thing to say. Gideon didn't look at him. He turned his back on Pryor, walked toward the woman bracing herself with both hands against the wet bricks, and lowered himself onto one knee beside her. He took off his wool coat and draped it around her shoulders, drawing both sides together across the front. And he did it slowly, as though there were no one else in the alley at all. Then he held out his hand. Marlowe looked at it. She placed her hand in his, and he helped her to her feet. They brought her back into the shop through the rear door, and someone flipped the sign on the front window to closed, pulled down the shade, then shut the door. Outside, the street was still filled with voices, the sound of engines starting and driving away, someone calling another person's name, but all of it seemed to come from somewhere very far away. Inside the shop, there was only the yellow light above the counter and the smell of cold coffee from the unfinished batch left over from the night before. Marlowe sat on the high stool at the end of the counter, the charcoal wool coat still draped around her shoulders, both hands wrapped around a glass of water someone had poured for her. She didn't drink it. She only held it because she needed something to hold. The man stood a few steps away, leaning back against the edge of the counter, not sitting down. And for a long while he didn't say anything either. He left her alone. That was the first thing she noticed about him. Otis Brantley had walked past the front window 3 times, each time turning away again, and Marlowe saw all of it, but she didn't say anything about it. After a while, she raised her head. She looked directly at the man's face, really looked at him for the first time, beneath the light rather than in the shadows of the alley. She studied the line of his jaw, the thin scar running across his left eyebrow that she hadn't noticed earlier, and inside her head she heard that voice again, low and slow, almost calm. The glass in her hands tilted slightly. She said she knew him. She said he was the man she had given the towel to. Gideon didn't look surprised. He only gave a slight nod, as though he had been waiting for her to say those words far longer than she realized. He said she had given him 40 minutes on a night when no one else in the city had been willing to give him 4 seconds. Marlowe set the glass down on the counter. She said that night she had thought he was going to die out there, that the next morning when she opened the door, there had been no one left on the step, only the empty cup placed neatly beside the wall and the towel folded into a careful square on top of it. She said that for years afterward, she had found herself thinking about that night at the strangest moments, and that she had never told anyone. Gideon looked down at the wooden counter. He lifted one hand and ran it lightly along the smooth, polished edge, then pulled his hand away. Marlowe asked what he did for a living. She asked him directly, without circling around it, because she had seen 4 men step out of 2 cars outside and she wasn't a fool. Gideon raised his eyes to hers. He held her gaze for a long moment, and in that instant Marlowe saw something pass across his face and disappear again, so quickly that later she wouldn't even be certain she had seen it at all. Then he turned away and looked toward the window. He didn't answer. Marlowe waited. She waited long enough to understand that he wasn't going to answer, and she didn't ask a second time. She pulled the 2 sides of his coat closer together and said she would give it back to him. He told her to keep it on, that it was cold outside. At that exact moment, the rear door opened, and Rune Vasquez stepped inside, carrying with him the smell of cigarette smoke and the cold morning air. In his hands was a thick file secured with a rubber band. He walked straight to the counter and set it down on the wood in front of them. Then he stood upright. He looked at Marlowe once, then at Gideon, then back at Marlowe. He didn't say anything, but there was something in the way he looked at her that made Marlowe lower her eyes toward the file on the counter, and printed across its cover was the name of a company she had never heard of before. They didn't open the file there. Rune only said it shouldn't be read inside the shop, and Gideon nodded. Then he told Marlowe that someone would remain outside the door until daylight had fully come, and that she shouldn't open it for anyone. She was about to say she didn't need anyone guarding her door, but she looked down at her own hand, trembling against the counter, and said nothing. The 2 men left through the rear entrance. Their car headed toward the bridge, then turned into a low building near the riverfront, and they went all the way to the top floor, where a broad balcony overlooked the black water and the rows of warehouse lights stretching toward the bend in the river. Rune pulled off the rubber band, opened the file across the concrete railing, and began to speak. He said there was an investment group behind the riverfront project, and that the investor wasn't a single name, but a chain of names. One company registered in another state was owned by another company, which in turn belonged to a trust that had taken him almost the entire night to dig out from the paperwork. Rune turned to the final page and stopped there. He didn't read it aloud. He simply turned the sheet around and pushed it toward Gideon, and on the line marked Ultimate Owner, printed in the bold black ink of an office printer, was the name Falco Holdings. Wind rose from the river and sent the upper pages fluttering. Gideon didn't pick up the sheet. He looked at it, then out across the water, and for so long he said nothing that Rune had to turn and study his face. Rune said there was one more thing. His voice dropped. He said the original debt list for that entire block, the list Pryor was holding and using to squeeze one property after another, hadn't been created by Pryor. He said it had existed long before him, far longer, and that the man who had made it was. He stopped there. He couldn't bring himself to finish the sentence. Gideon finished it for him. He said it had belonged to his father. He said it as calmly as if he were reading out a number, then added that he already knew. Rune turned fully toward him. He asked how long Gideon had known. Gideon kept looking out over the water. He said since the first time he drove past that shop. Rune stood silent. He had followed this man long enough to understand exactly what those words meant, without asking another question, and that understanding sent a deeper chill through him than the warehouse the night before. For years, several times every month, That car had passed along that street and slowed at one particular place. It wasn't because Gideon hadn't been able to find her. He had found her the week after that winter night, easily enough that it had taken only one phone call. But when he had someone look into the name of the shop and the name of its former owner, the name of the woman who had given birth to Marlowe appeared in a ledger he had inherited along with everything else from his father. And from that day forward, he hadn't gone inside. He had only driven past. Rune asked what happened now. Gideon closed the file, secured the rubber band around it, and said that now she had the right to know. Rune said that if she found out, she would never look at him again. Gideon picked up the file and started toward the stairs, and he said that was exactly what should have happened years ago. He returned to the shop late that afternoon, when the rain had begun again, the fine, persistent rain of the season's end. Marlowe was drying glasses behind the counter. She still hadn't opened the doors to customers, and the charcoal wool coat had been neatly folded and placed on the high stool at the end of the counter, waiting to be returned. Gideon set the file on the wood, removed the rubber band, and said there were several things he needed to tell her, and that she was going to want to sit down. She didn't sit. He began with the riverfront project. He said the investor behind it wasn't one company but a chain of companies layered over one another, and that at the very end, in the layer no one was ever supposed to see, was a trust that had been sitting untouched since the previous generation. He turned to the last page and rotated the paper toward her, and he didn't read a single word for her. Marlowe lowered her eyes to the name printed in bold on the line marked owner. She read it twice. Then she looked up at him, and he nodded. He continued. He said the debt list Pryor was using to squeeze each property along this block hadn't been created by Pryor, that Pryor had only bought it, that the list had existed since before she was born. He said the man who had created it was his father. He said that in those years, inside that ledger, there had been the names of many people on this street, and among them was the name of the woman who had given birth to her. He said her mother had paid money every month, regularly, year after year, to a name she had never once met in person. The glass in Marlowe's hand came down onto the counter very slowly. Gideon told her the final part, the part he could have left unsaid, and no one would ever have known. He said that according to what was written in those documents, if this shop were seized and sold into the development project, then the person who would ultimately benefit at the end of that ownership chain was him. Then he fell silent. He didn't add another word. He didn't explain that he had never read through the inventory of assets he inherited from his father. Didn't say that he had inherited the organization rather than the paperwork. Didn't say that he hadn't known until the night before. He simply stood there and allowed what he had just told her to remain on the counter between them. Marlowe rose from the stool. She gripped the edge of the counter with both hands, and she stood that way for a while, her head lowered, her shoulders rising and falling with every breath. Then she spoke. She asked whether he knew why her mother had worked 2 jobs. She said her mother opened the shop before daylight and closed it late at night, and that 3 nights a week she also cleaned an office building near the bus station. That for all those years, Marlowe had believed it was only because her mother was the kind of woman who didn't know how to sit still. She said her mother had collapsed in the kitchen one morning while carrying a tray of glasses, that she had lain there until someone pushed open the door, and that even then Marlowe hadn't understood how a woman who worked that much could still come up short every single month. She raised her head. She said now she knew the name. She said it was his last name. Gideon said nothing. He didn't defend himself, didn't apologize, didn't say it had happened when he had still been too young to understand any of it. He only looked at her, and he took every word she gave him without turning away. Marlowe walked out from behind the counter, crossed to the front door, and opened it. Rain blew across the threshold. She stood holding the door and didn't say anything else. Gideon picked up the file, then stopped, and placed it back on the counter. He walked past where she stood and went outside, stopping in the rain several steps from the threshold. The door closed behind him. He remained there for a long time, rain soaking through the shoulders of his shirt, and he didn't look back. Late that night, at his nightclub, on the south side of the city, the music was still playing as it did every night, when Ambrose Vetter walked in with 2 of his men and sat down at the table across from Gideon, without waiting to be invited. Vetter was the kind of man who talked more when he believed he had the advantage. He said the whole city was talking about Falco interfering in some petty collection matter at the market because of a waitress, that people were beginning to say he was going soft, that when a knife started to dull, everyone wanted to test what it could still cut. Gideon didn't stand. He didn't set down his drink. He simply reached beside his chair, picked up a thick paper envelope, and slid it across the tabletop toward the other side. Vetter laughed, picked it up, opened it, and pulled out the photographs inside. The The smile on his face died a little more with every picture. By the third photograph, he stopped. He shoved the entire stack back into the envelope, with fingers that had suddenly become clumsy, set his drink on the table without taking a single sip, stood up, and walked straight toward the door, without saying goodbye to anyone. His 2 men exchanged a glance, then hurried after him. Rune waited until the door had closed before saying that Gideon had just lost an ally. Gideon looked at the envelope left behind on the table. He said he had just learned that he had gained another witness. The next morning, there was a message waiting on her phone. A man from a city to the east said he was opening a small shop and needed a machine like hers, that he could send a truck to pick it up that same day if they agreed on a price. Marlowe read the message 3 times. She looked toward the corner of the counter, where the copper machine still stood in the exact place it had occupied for 30 years, and she typed back a single word: yes. The technician arrived after lunch, a middle-aged man wearing a tool belt and pushing a hand truck, and he had done this often enough not to ask any questions. He disconnected the power, removed the water line, drained the reservoir completely, and wiped the body of the machine dry with a rag. Then he said he would have to remove the cast iron base before he could determine the shipping weight, because the transport company charged by weight, and the base was heavier than the machine itself. He tilted the machine onto one side, wedged a block of wood underneath it, and took out a wrench. Marlowe watched him loosen the first bolt, then the second. Metal groaned through the empty shop, harsh and dry, and every sound felt like something being unscrewed from inside her chest. By the third bolt, she stepped forward. She told him to let her do it. The technician looked up, hesitated slightly, then seemed to understand something and didn't argue. He handed her the wrench, stood, and said he would go outside for a cigarette, then walked to the door and closed it behind him. Marlowe knelt alone on the floor beside the tilted machine. She held the wrench in her hand and remained still for a long while. She looked at the dark, polished copper where hands had touched it most often, the place where her mother had rested her palm every morning for nearly 30 years, the place where Marlowe herself had pressed Toby's hand so the boy could feel the vibration. She thought about the first batch of coffee her mother had taught her to make, when Marlowe had still needed to stand on a wooden crate just to reach the steam wand. She thought about the morning her mother collapsed in the kitchen and the tray of glasses shattered, and about how only now did she understand that throughout all those years, somewhere, some name had been taking away most of what her mother earned. She fitted the wrench onto the third bolt and turned. It was tight. She switched hands, leaned her whole shoulder into it, and it moved 1 turn, then 2, before finally coming free and rolling across the wooden floor. She moved to the 4th bolt. That one was looser. By the time she reached the last bolt, her hands were trembling and her vision had blurred, and she had to stop and wipe her face with the hem of her apron before continuing. She turned the wrench. Her tears fell onto the cold cast iron and spread into dark stains across the dust that had gathered there over the years. She kept turning, never crying aloud, the tears simply continuing to fall because she no longer bothered trying to stop them. The final bolt came free. She set the wrench down on the floor. She reached down with both hands and lifted the cast iron base, and it was heavier than she expected, so heavy that she had to brace it against both knees. She lowered it onto its side, and inside, in the hollow compartment that served as a counterweight for the machine, a compartment no one would ever open unless the machine was being dismantled for transport, something was lying there. Marlowe froze. She sank down onto the floor and stared inside. It was a thick plastic bag, the kind with a zipper seal, folded and tucked neatly into one corner of the compartment, the plastic yellowed by time and heat. She reached inside and pulled it out. The bag was heavier than it looked. She placed it on her lap, opened the zipper, and found 2 things inside: a brown leather notebook about the size of her hand, the kind sold in office supply stores along the street, and a small black memory card wrapped separately inside a paper napkin folded into quarters. Marlowe took out the notebook first. She opened to the first page, and her entire body went cold. The handwriting on the page slanted to the right. The first letter of every line was always larger than the rest, and the tail of every Y stretched farther downward than it needed to. She had seen that handwriting on notes stuck to the refrigerator, on hastily scribbled receipts, on the last birthday card she had ever received from him. It was Shane Doyle's handwriting. She turned the page. Every page was the same, divided by hand into 3 columns with a ruler. The column on the left contained names. The middle column contained dates. The column on the right contained numbers. She skimmed down the list, and her hand began to tremble. Halverson's shoe shop, Delaney's flower shop, Brantley's bakery, the instrument repair shop at the end of the street. The full name of the woman who had given birth to her, including her last name, written near the middle of the list. And on it went, one name after another. The same names Marlo wrote on paper cups every morning. The same names whose coffee habits she knew by heart. She counted them. She counted a second time, because the first time, she had lost track when her hands began to shake. 19 names. On the final page, beneath the column of numbers, there was a line written more hurriedly than everything else, the ink darker, as though the writer had pressed the pen harder against the paper. Marlo bent closer to read it. Then she sat upright, pressed the notebook against her chest, and looked toward the memory card still resting inside the folded paper napkin on her lap. She paid the technician for his work and told him she had changed her mind, that she wasn't selling the machine after all, and she returned the deposit the buyer had already transferred. The technician shrugged, packed up his tools, and before leaving, he even helped her reinstall the cast iron base and tighten all 5 bolts back into place. When the door closed and the street outside had gone completely dark, Marlo locked the front door, turned off some of the lights, brought her old laptop down to the counter, and inserted the memory card. There was only one file on it, an audio recording, more than 20 minutes long, with no title, only a string of numbers marking a date that she recognized immediately as one of the final days of Shane Doyle's life. She sat on the high stool, pulled the screen closer, and pressed play. There was a rustling sound, then breathing. Then Shane's voice, very close to the microphone, hoarse and tired, the voice she hadn't heard in all those months, suddenly filling the empty shop so completely that she had to grip the edge of the counter with both hands. He said that if someone was listening to this, it meant he hadn't made it back. He said he was recording it because he no longer trusted paperwork, and because he wanted something no one could forge. Then he began to tell the story. He said he had been doing bookkeeping work for Hollis Pryor for nearly a year, that at first he had believed it was nothing more than ordinary loan records, and that by the time he understood what he was actually copying, it was already too late. He said that every month Pryor gave him a list and made him reconcile the amounts, and that some of those loans belonged to people who didn't even know they had borrowed anything. He said he had quietly copied the entire original list into a notebook and hidden it away. Then his voice dropped. He said that when Pryor started asking about her shop, about her home address, about who lived in the house, he understood that he couldn't stay any longer. He said he had emptied the shop's bank account, and he said he hadn't spent a single dollar of it, that he had moved the money somewhere else and prepared the paperwork carefully, and that when the time was right, someone would bring it to her. He said he had to leave, had to make the entire city believe he was a gambling man who had abandoned his wife, because only if people believed that would Pryor stop looking toward the shop. He said he was sorry for letting her think of him that way, and that it was the only thing he had been able to think of. Marlo sat completely still. Tears ran down her face, and she didn't lift a hand to wipe them away. Then another sound entered the recording. A car door. Wind. Shane's voice became much quieter, almost a whisper, saying that he was waiting for the man, that this was the only person left in the city he still trusted, and that if he gave him the notebook, everything would be over within a week. There were footsteps on gravel, then a second voice. A man's voice, low and broad, warm and familiar. The voice of a neighbor asking after the family. The voice said, "Let me see that," then asked whether it was the original or a copy, then asked whether anyone else knew besides Shane, whether he had left any copies at home. Marlo couldn't breathe. She knew that voice. She had sat across from it less than 3 days earlier, separated by a glass-topped desk, while the man who owned it ate half a sandwich and asked her those exact same 2 questions. Captain Dale Renner. The recording continued for a little longer, then cut off in the middle. Marlo sat motionless before the glowing screen in the darkened shop. 3 days after that meeting, Shane Doyle's car had been found at the bottom of the bridge, and the entire city had called it an accident, and she had believed it too. She had stood beside his grave carrying an anger that she now understood she had aimed at the wrong place for 7 long months. She understood why Renner had asked whether it was the original or a copy. She understood why he had asked whether her husband had left any records at home. And she understood who had forced open the back door of her shop that night, torn through every drawer, opened even the tins of powder on the shelves, then left without touching a single coin in the tip box, because what that person had been searching for wasn't money, and he had stood only an arm's length from the thing he needed, without ever knowing it. Outside, across the street, a black sedan sat angled in the darkness between 2 streetlights, its headlights long since turned off. Rune sat in the passenger seat, lightly tapping his fingers against his knee, and asked how long Gideon planned to sit there. Gideon didn't take his eyes off the second-floor window where a light was still burning. He said, until that light went out. Marlo didn't sleep that night. She sat at the counter until the sky began turning the pale gray that comes before dawn, the brown leather notebook lying in front of her, and she had read all 19 names so many times that she could recite them in order from memory. She switched on the espresso machine out of habit, even though she had no intention of opening the shop. And the sound of the copper machine shuddering and beginning to breathe made the room feel a little less empty. At that exact moment, there came a knock against the glass. Not a hard knock. 3 light, widely spaced taps, the kind made by someone who wasn't sure she had the right to knock at all. Marlo raised the shade. Outside, beneath the streetlight that was still burning, Mrs. Nadine Foss stood there with her wool coat buttoned all the way to the neck and a small handbag held against her stomach with both hands. Marlo unlocked the door. Nadine stepped inside, didn't remove her coat, walked straight to the counter, and stood there for a while before setting the bag down. She opened it. She took out an object and placed it on the wood between them, and the sound of metal touching wood rang dry and sharp through the quiet shop. It was a fountain pen with a gold cap. Marlo looked down at it. She had seen an identical pen turning slowly between Hollis Pryor's fingers on this very counter less than a week earlier. Nadine sat on the high stool. She didn't look at Marlo. She looked at the pen. Then she began to speak in the flat, measured voice of someone reading year-end figures aloud, saying that she had sat behind the counter at that credit union since before it had even been called a credit union. She said that through all those years, every person on this street had signed a specimen signature card when they opened the first account of their lives, and those cards had been kept in filing boxes, and she had been the one who placed them there. She said she knew exactly where Mr. Halverson's handwriting trembled, knew that Miss Delaney always forgot to dot the letter I, knew that Marlo's mother signed her name in one continuous stroke without ever lifting the pen. She said there was no one in the world who could imitate those signatures as closely as she could. Marlo stood motionless behind the counter. She couldn't say a word. Nadine continued. She said her husband had been in the hospital for a long time, that in the beginning she had managed somehow, and then came the point when she couldn't manage anymore. She said Mr. Pryor came to see her one afternoon, and he hadn't threatened her with a single word. He had simply placed a paid hospital bill on the table and told her that he would come back again the following month. She said the first time she held the pen, her hand shook so badly that she had to write the name 3 times. She said the second time was easier. She said after that it became something she did on Thursday nights, sometime between cooking dinner and going to bed, and every name she wrote bought 1 more month of medicine for the man lying in that hospital bed. Then she fell silent. She reached out and touched the pen on the counter but didn't pick it up. She said that when Marlo had brought those papers to the credit union, she had only needed to look down at the signature to know. She said she hadn't needed to read the dates, hadn't needed to read anything at all, because she recognized her own pen stroke, the tail of the letter that she always made slightly shorter than the original, a habit she had tried many times to correct and never could. She said she had pushed the paper back toward Marlo and told her she couldn't help. Then, for the first time since entering the shop, she raised her eyes and looked directly at Marlo. She said Marlo remembered her drink. She said every morning, for all those years, Marlo remembered 1 small cup, plenty of milk foam, not much coffee, and never once had she needed to ask again. She said that while Marlo remembered that, she had been signing Marlo's husband's name onto papers. She said she hadn't come there to ask for forgiveness, that she had no intention of saying anything that would make what she had done sound smaller, and that she knew exactly what she had done and how many times she had done it. She said Marlo should call the police, and she would sit right there and wait. Marlo remained completely still for a long time. Then she turned around. She reached for a small ceramic cup on the shelf, placed it beneath the spout, and pulled the lever. The copper machine breathed out a long sigh. She steamed the milk until the foam grew thick and smooth, poured it into the cup, then added exactly the same amount of coffee she always did, not a single drop more. She set the cup on a saucer, placed the small spoon beside it, then carried it around the counter and set it down in front of Mrs. Nadine Foss. Nadine looked down at the coffee. Her hand rose to cover her mouth, and she couldn't speak anymore. She sat there with her shoulders trembling while outside, daylight slowly spread across the street. Marlo stood beside her with one hand resting on her shoulder, and she left it there until Nadine could breathe normally again. Then Marlo went back behind the counter, picked up the phone, and dialed the number. Federal agents arrived at noon, and they remained inside the shop for nearly 2 hours. When they escorted Mrs. Nadine Foss out to the car, she walked with her back straight, needing no one to support her, and she didn't look toward the row of storefronts standing half open along the street. That afternoon, Marlo closed the shop, tucked the brown leather notebook under one arm, and began walking down the block. The last time she had walked this street, she had carried a stack of papers in her hands and a question on her lips. And every door had closed in front of her. This time, she didn't ask anyone for anything. She knocked first at the shoe shop. When Mr. Halverson opened the door, she didn't ask him to help. She opened the notebook right there on the threshold, turned to the page where his name appeared, pointed to the line, and told him to read it. He read it. Then he read it again. Then he looked up and asked where she had gotten it, and Marlowe said it had been hidden inside her mother's espresso machine for the past 7 months. She said she was inviting him to the shop the following evening, that there would be coffee, that he wouldn't have to pay for anything, and wouldn't have to promise anything either. He only needed to come and listen. Then she went next door. She did exactly the same thing at Miss Delaney's flower shop, at the instrument repair shop, at the end of the street, at the dry goods store, at the breakfast place on the corner. She didn't beg once. She simply opened the notebook, pointed to their names, and invited them over. By late afternoon, she was standing in front of the bakery, and Otis Brantley opened the door before she even had a chance to knock. He had watched her make her way down the entire street from behind the glass. He stood there with flour still clinging to his hands, and he couldn't bring himself to look directly into her eyes. Marlowe opened the notebook to the page with his name and handed it to him. He read it, and his hands began to tremble, and he had to set the notebook down on top of the glass display case. He said he was sorry for what had happened that morning. He said he had put his hand on the door handle and then let it go, and that he would carry that with him for the rest of his life. Marlowe said she hadn't come there to hear that. She said she had come to invite him to the shop the following evening. Otis was silent for a while. Then he looked up and said he had something. He led her through the back of the bakery and up a narrow iron staircase that climbed to the roof. And there, beneath a rotting tarp, stood a large brass bell mounted on a wooden frame, green with age and weather, with a length of rope hanging down along the wall. He said that generations ago, when the entire market had still been made of wooden buildings, they had hung that bell there to warn of fire. He said that whenever someone was in trouble, they pulled the bell, and anyone who heard it turned on the lights and came running. That was all. No one needed to call anyone. No one needed to know what had happened first. He said his father had pulled it twice in his lifetime. He said it had been silent since Otis himself was a young man. Then he picked up the rope, shook the dust from it, and handed the end to her. He said that from that night on, he would leave the door to the roof unlocked. That evening, Marlowe took a bus across the city to a low building near the riverfront, with a dark stone facade and no sign displaying a name. The security guard in the lobby stopped her and said this wasn't a place people could simply walk into. Marlowe didn't argue. She only asked him to tell the man upstairs that the woman who poured the coffee wanted to see him. The guard studied her for a moment, then picked up the intercom phone and spoke a few words into it. He listened, then he put the receiver down, and the elevator doors behind her opened. On the top floor, Gideon was standing beside the glass looking down at the river, and he turned when he heard the door open. Marlowe didn't greet him. She walked straight to the long table in the middle of the room, placed the brown leather notebook on its surface, and pushed it toward him. She said she didn't forgive his last name. She said that wasn't going to change, and he shouldn't wait for it to. Then she said there were 19 names in that notebook, that she didn't know how to read it the way it needed to be read, and that she needed someone who did. She looked directly into his eyes and asked whether he would help or not. He said he would help. He said only those 2 words and nothing more, and Marlowe gave a single nod before leaving, and both of them understood that it was enough. The following night, Gideon and Rune went down to the warehouse district along the riverfront to collect comparison copies of several old contracts that Rune had arranged to have pulled from an archival office, and they arrived close to midnight. From the slope leading down toward the docks, they saw it before they heard it. A dull orange glow stained the sky behind the row of warehouses, and smoke rose in a thick column before the river wind drove it sideways. An entire line of stacked shipping containers in the eastern yard was burning, and the flames had already traveled so far along the row that the far end of the lot had become nothing more than a trembling mass of light in the darkness. The sound of expanding metal cracking in the heat carried across the water like someone striking a massive drum. Rune cursed under his breath. Gideon said nothing. He slowed the car, his eyes moving along the dark warehouses to their left, and told Rune not to get out. At that exact moment, there was a sharp, dry impact, and the entire car jolted. On the passenger side window, level with Rune's shoulder, a white crater suddenly appeared, with fractures spreading outward from it like a spiderweb. The glass didn't shatter. Rune sat frozen, staring at the mark less than a handspan from his face. Gideon hit the accelerator, swung the car back up the slope, and they tore toward the main road as fire alarms began screaming behind them. It wasn't until they reached the streetlights that Rune said there seemed to be something wrong with his shoulder. At the hospital, they bandaged his shoulder and told him he had to stay overnight. Gideon sat on the plastic chair beside the bed, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together, and he didn't ask a single question. Rune stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then he said there was something he had to tell him. He said the container yard wasn't a place everyone knew about, that only 4 people in the organization had known the 2 of them would be going there that night. He said the 4th person was him. He said that 2 weeks earlier someone had come to him, placed a sheet of paper on the table, and on that paper was his mother's name beside a debt she had never borrowed from anyone. He said she was 74 years old and lived in a small house on the west side that she had spent her entire life paying off. He said he had sent one message, exactly one, nothing but the location and the time, and he hadn't believed they would go this far. Then he fell silent. He didn't apologize. He only turned his face toward the window and waited. Gideon remained still for a very long time. Long enough for the heart monitor to count through dozens of beats. Long enough for a nurse to pass through the hallway outside and disappear from view. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a sheet of paper folded into quarters. He opened it, turned it so Rune could see, and there it was, the exact document Rune had just described, his mother's name on the borrower line and the amount in the column to the right. Rune turned his head back, his eyes widening. He asked when Gideon had gotten it. Gideon didn't answer. He held the paper in both hands and tore it in half, then into quarters. Then he kept tearing until all that remained was a handful of scraps in his palm, and he placed them on the small table beside the bed, next to the glass of water and the television remote. He stood, pulled the blanket up to Rune's chest, and started toward the door. Rune called his name. Gideon stopped at the threshold but didn't turn around, and he said to get some sleep, because there was still a lot of work to do tomorrow. Then he left. He drove alone across the city, over the bridge, past rows of streetlights growing farther and farther apart. And somehow, without knowing exactly why, he found himself parking at the entrance to the market street near dawn. He got out and walked to the front of the copper kettle. The lights inside were still on. Through the window, clouded with steam, he could see Marlo sitting at the end of the counter with the notebook open in front of her and a pen in her hand, copying something onto another sheet of paper. Her hair tied back hastily, her apron still on even though the shop had been closed for hours. He stood outside in the cold before sunrise, both hands in his coat pockets, and watched her work for a very long time. Then he turned, walked back toward the car, and didn't go inside. Hollis Pryor was released on bail at the end of that week. His attorney posted the bond before sunset, and Pryor walked out of the courthouse through a side entrance without saying a single word to the press, then went straight home. He didn't call anyone. He was the kind of man clear-headed enough to understand that once federal agents had the records in their hands, the most foolish thing anyone could do was touch a witness. But there was someone else in that city who no longer had that kind of judgment. Captain Dale Renner had spent 2 straight days sitting inside his office, with the door closed, and the drawer on the right side of his desk hanging wide open. And he knew better than anyone that what waited for him wasn't 15 years for document fraud. What waited at the end of that road had another name, and no lawyer could get him out of it. He also knew the notebook had come out of hiding, but he didn't believe that woman had found it anywhere outside the shop, and he had already searched that shop once. Every drawer, every box, every crack and hollow space, except one place. The only object inside the shop he hadn't been able to open with his bare hands. That night, Toby slept at Mrs. Brantley's place above the bakery, just as he had throughout the past week. His bedroom door closed, the nightlight turned low, and the boy had no idea what was unfolding out on the street. Marlo stayed alone inside the shop with the notebook and the pages she had copied out by hand. Close to 1 a.m, she heard a small truck pull up at the end of the street, its engine shut off, and for a long moment, no one got out. She rose from her stool and turned off the counter lights. Wes Corrigan stepped out with one hand still in a brace and the other carrying a plastic fuel can. He walked along the sidewalk, stopped in front of the copper kettle, and looked through the glass into the darkened shop. He didn't know why he had been told to come. The person who called him had only said that the espresso machine inside that shop had to disappear tonight, not the shop, the machine. And Corrigan had asked once before, deciding not to ask again. He set the can on the front step and reached into his pocket for something to pry open the door. Inside the shop, Marlo didn't run. She didn't scream, didn't call anyone, didn't reach for her phone. She went out through the rear door, crossed the alley behind the row of buildings, opened the door Otis Brantley had left unlocked for the past several nights, and climbed the narrow iron staircase to the roof of the bakery. Up there, beneath a starless sky, the tarnished green brass bell rested silently in its wooden frame, the rope hanging loose beside it. Marlowe wrapped both hands around the end of the rope. She drew in a breath. Then she pulled. The first peal of the bell broke across the market like something waking after decades of sleep, deep and heavy, striking the brick walls and rolling back again. She pulled once more, then again. The sound traveled down the street, slipped through the alleys, and struck the windows of every building in turn. Down below, Wes Corrigan snapped his head up. Then a second-floor window above the shoe shop lit up. Then the lights inside Miss Delaney's flower shop came on, casting a yellow strip across the sidewalk. Then the instrument repair shop. Then the breakfast place on the corner. Then the dry goods store. The lights kept coming on, one after another, running the length of the entire street, as though someone were lighting candles one by one along a long table. Then the doors began to open. Mr. Halverson stepped onto the sidewalk in his pajamas with a coat hurriedly thrown over his shoulders. Miss Delaney stood on her front step, with both arms folded across herself. The instrument repairman walked all the way into the street and stopped there. One after another, they came out of their homes and shops and stood along both sides of the street, no one holding anything, no one saying a word, every one of them looking toward the same place. Wes Corrigan stood between those two rows of lights, with the plastic can at his feet. He turned his head toward one end of the street, then toward the other, and both ends were already lined with people. He saw the old baker he had gone to threaten that afternoon. He saw the woman who owned the flower shop, whose door he had knocked on twice that year to collect money. He saw face after face, and every one of those faces knew his name. No one stepped toward him. No one raised a hand. They simply stood there and watched him beneath the lights of their own shops. On the bakery roof, the bell fell silent, and the silence that followed was heavier than the sound had been. Corrigan lowered his eyes. He pushed the plastic can away from the front step with the back of his foot. Then he sat down on the steps of the copper kettle, rested both elbows on his knees, and bowed his head. When the patrol cars arrived along with two unmarked federal vehicles, he didn't stand up and he didn't resist. He only said he wanted to talk. Right now, right there, in front of all those people. Then he gave them a name. Captain Dale Renner was arrested on the steps of his own home before sunrise, and the man who fastened the handcuffs around his wrists was a sergeant who had served under him for 9 years. The trial opened on a late autumn morning in a courtroom on the 4th floor of the federal building, where the windows rose nearly to the ceiling and sunlight fell diagonally across the wooden benches in long bands of light. Marlowe arrived before the doors officially opened, wearing the only decent coat she still owned, and she sat in the front row with the brown leather notebook resting on her lap. Gideon came later and sat down one seat away from her. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he leaned slightly toward her, his voice low enough that only she could hear, and he said she only had to say one word, and by tomorrow morning there wouldn't be anyone named Hollis Pryor left in this city. He didn't say it boastfully. He didn't say it as a threat. He said it in the voice of a man simply describing an option that was within his reach. Marlowe didn't turn to look at him right away. She looked down at the notebook in her lap, at the leather cover worn at the corners, and she shook her head. She said that if he did that, then tomorrow the people on that street would only be afraid of a different name. She said that for years they had lived in fear of one name, and before that name there had been another, and if a stronger man appeared now to clean everything up for them, then all they would have done was change owners. They still wouldn't be free. She said she didn't need Pryor to disappear. She said she needed the 19 names in that notebook to be spoken aloud in daylight, inside a room with windows, with someone taking notes and people sitting there listening, so that the next time someone came to her door holding a piece of paper, she would know she was allowed to say no. Gideon looked at her. Then he nodded, straightened in his seat, and didn't say another word for the rest of that morning. They called the witnesses one by one. Mr. Halverson went first, both hands gripping the sides of the witness stand, and he read his own name, then read the amount he had paid for years toward a loan he had never taken out. Then Miss Delaney. Then the instrument repairman. Then the woman who owned the breakfast place on the corner. Then the owner of the dry goods store, one after another, each person standing and speaking their own name aloud in that sunlit room. When Marlowe's turn came, she read her mother's full name, including her last name, slowly and clearly, each word distinct, and she had to stop for a moment in the middle before she could finish. Otis Brantley was the 19th. He stood, walked to the witness stand with the gait of a man older than his years, and before giving his testimony, He told the entire courtroom that one morning he had stood behind a pane of glass and had not opened the door. He said he would never say that sentence a second time in his life, but he wanted it entered into the record. Then the door at the back of the courtroom opened. A tall man in a dark suit stepped inside, and several people in the rear rows turned to look, because in that city there were faces people recognized even when they wished they didn't. Ambrose Vetter took the stand as the 20th witness. He testified that for years he had made regular payments on a debt he believed was his, and that not long ago he had been shown photographs of the contract, photographs clear enough to capture every stroke of the handwriting, and he had recognized that the signature on the final line hadn't been written by his hand. He said he had been paying money to a name for all those years without ever knowing who he was actually paying. When he stepped down, he passed Gideon's seat, and neither man looked at the other. At the end of the session, the defendants were escorted out through a side exit. Wes Corrigan walked between two officers, and when he passed the front row, he stopped for a brief moment. He didn't look directly at Marlowe. He looked down at the floor and said he had an elderly mother on the west side, and that Pryor had papers on her too. Then he fell silent. Marlowe remained seated. She didn't say anything. She only nodded once, gently and slowly, the nod of someone who had heard and fully understood what had just been said, but not the nod of someone offering forgiveness. Corrigan lowered his head and kept walking. Beyond the tall windows, sunlight continued to fall diagonally across the wooden floor. And in the official record of that day's proceedings, 19 names had been spoken aloud and written down in the full light of day. 3 days after the trial, just as Marlowe had opened the shop and was rearranging the stack of cups on the shelf, a middle-aged man walked in carrying an old leather briefcase against his chest. His shirt hung a little loose on him. His hair had been combed without much care, and he stood in the middle of the shop for a long moment before he finally gathered the courage to approach the counter. Marlowe recognized him immediately. Perry Odom set the briefcase on the wooden counter, released the clasps, and his hands were trembling so badly that it took him 2 tries to open the small lock. He took out a pale yellow envelope, its corners softened from being handled so many times, and placed it between them. He said he had been holding onto it for 7 months. Then he began to speak, slowly and unevenly, like a man who had rehearsed the story in his mind again and again but still couldn't find a way to make it simple. He said that in the spring, a young man had come to his office, paid him in cash, and asked him to establish a trust. He said the man had brought a bag of money and told him that every dollar had to remain untouched, not invested, not borrowed against, and that the funds could only be released when the hospital sent written confirmation of a scheduled surgery for the beneficiary. He said the beneficiary was a boy named Toby Kessler. Marlowe placed one hand against the edge of the counter. Mr. Odom said the trust notice had been sent on time, mailed to the address the man had entered in the paperwork, an apartment on the north side of the city. He said he hadn't known that Marlowe had moved away from there long ago and had been living permanently above the shop. He said the letter had been sent 3 times, and not once had anyone replied, and that he had been planning to go looking for her himself when someone came looking for him first. He said that one afternoon, a police officer in plain clothes had stopped by his office, sat down in a friendly manner, and asked about documents that a man named Doyle might have left with him. Mr. Odom said he had lied, told the officer he didn't remember the name, and that the officer had smiled, thanked him, and left. He said that from that day forward, he hadn't dared open that cabinet again. Then he said that when Marlowe came into his office the previous week and spoke that last name aloud, he had understood everything immediately, and he had been so frightened that he closed the office that very night and left the city. He looked up at her, his eyes red, and said he was sorry that he had been afraid for so long. Marlowe picked up the envelope. Inside was the trust paperwork, and the amount written on the first page was exactly the same amount that had disappeared from the shop's account that spring, not $1 missing. Beneath the documents was a sheet of paper folded in half, handwritten in blue ink, the letters slanting to the right, the tails of certain letters stretching farther than they needed to. Marlowe opened it right there at the counter in front of Mr. Odom because she couldn't wait. On that sheet of paper, Shane Doyle had written that he didn't dare come home. He wrote that if he came back, they would find her, and that was the one thing he couldn't trade away. He wrote that he knew what she would think of him and that he accepted it. Then, on the final line, he wrote that when the boy heard sound for the first time in his life, she shouldn't let the first thing he heard be Shane's name. He wrote that she should let him hear the espresso machine. He wrote that the boy loved that sound. Marlowe stood there for a very long time with the letter in her hands, unable to say a word. And Perry Odom quietly closed his briefcase and walked toward the door without saying goodbye, because he understood that this wasn't a moment for goodbyes. On the morning they went to the hospital, the sky was clear, and sunlight poured through the large windows of the room. Toby sat in a blue upholstered chair, his legs swinging above the floor, his drawing papers clutched in his arms because he had refused to leave them at home. Marlo sat in the chair opposite him, her knees touching his. The technician said a few words, smiled, then switched on the device. For one moment, Toby sat perfectly still. Then he blinked. Then he turned his head sharply to the right, then to the left, his eyes wide as he searched the air for something he had never known existed. Marlo took her phone from her pocket. She opened a recording she had made one morning simply because she loved the sound. A recording of her mother's copper machine shuddering and then beginning to breathe. And she held the phone up. Toby's head snapped toward the sound. He stared at the phone in his sister's hand. He reached out and touched it, then pulled his hand away, then touched it again, and there was such pure bewilderment on the boy's face that the technician standing to his right had to turn away. Then Toby laughed. He laughed loudly, openly, the way a child laughs after being shown a magic trick, and almost immediately tears spilled from his eyes even though he didn't understand why. Marlo reached for him and pulled him into her arms, holding him tightly with one hand cradling the back of his head, and she pressed her face into his hair and cried without making a sound. Out in the hallway, visible through the narrow pane of glass in the door, Gideon Falco stood with both hands in his pockets. He watched for only a moment. Then, he turned his face away, looked down the length of the hallway, and stood there until his breathing became steady again. 6 weeks later, River Market woke to an ordinary morning like any other, except for one difference. Every door along the street was open. The trust that had lain dormant since the previous generation was dissolved at the request of the very person named as its heir, and every ownership interest it held through the chain of companies behind the riverfront project was dismantled layer by layer under the supervision of the court. The 19 properties along the block were transferred back into the names of the people who had lived and worked in them their entire lives, and not one of them had to pay a single dollar. Mr. Halverson began crying right there in the notary's office, and had to sit down for a long while. Miss Delaney rehung the old shop sign she had taken down during the summer. Otis Brantley built a new wooden sign for the copper kettle, planing the wood with his own hands, carving the letters himself, and refusing to take a cent for the work. That afternoon, Gideon came to the shop carrying a thin envelope. Inside were the loan documents bearing the name of the woman who had given birth to Marlo, stamped paid in full, the debt closed completely. He placed them on the counter and said that a city fund for small business owners had covered the remaining amount. Marlo picked up the paper, read it from beginning to end, then folded it and placed it in the drawer. She said thank you. She didn't ask another question, and she didn't tell him that she knew exactly what that fund really was. Then she poured him a cup of coffee, sat down on the high stool across from him, and told him to tell her properly about that winter night. Gideon did. He told her that he had been 29 that night, and had just lost 2 people, in something he still didn't want to name. He told her that he had walked nearly 1.25 miles along the river in the freezing wind because he couldn't allow anyone to see his car anywhere, that he had knocked on 2 doors, and both places had turned off their lights when they realized who he was. He said he had sat down on the back step of that little shop, only because it was the most sheltered place in the alley, and that he had already prepared himself for someone to call the police. Instead, the door opened, and a young woman holding a cleaning cloth stood there looking at him. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't ask whether he was dangerous. She went inside and came back with a clean towel and a cup of hot coffee, set both on the step beside him, then said that the door would be locked in 40 minutes before turning around and going back inside to finish cleaning the shop. He said he had sat there and finished the coffee while watching her through the narrow opening in the doorway, watching her wipe down each table one by one. He said that all his life, people had been afraid when he entered a room, and she was the only person who had ever opened a door for him without first asking who he was. Marlo was quiet for a while. Then she asked what he planned to do with the rest of his life. Gideon looked out the window, where several children were running along the sidewalk, and a woman was arranging flowers in wooden crates, and he said he was going to learn how to walk into a room without making anyone stand up. The final morning of this story began like every other morning at the copper kettle, with the grinder whining to life and the smell of fresh coffee filling the room. Toby sat at the corner table beside the window, his drawing paper spread open, a blue-colored pencil in his hand, drawing circles layered over one another and spreading outward from the center of the page. Every so often, he lifted his head, tilted it slightly to listen, then bent back over his drawing. Behind the counter, Gideon stood in front of the copper machine with a milk pitcher in his hand and an expression far more serious than the task required. The foam in the first cup failed. The second failed too. By the third, the milk overflowed the pitcher, and he muttered a quiet curse under his breath. And Marlowe laughed. The first laugh that had sounded completely real inside that shop in many months. She stepped closer, placed her hand over his, adjusted the angle of the pitcher just slightly, and left her hand there. Steam rose between them. Beyond the glass, sunlight had already reached the street, where 19 doors stood open. There are acts of kindness we perform that no one sees, no one records, no one thanks us for, and we imagine they disappear like steam into the air. But kindness doesn't need a witness in order to be kindness. A cup of hot coffee given to a stranger on a winter night can return years later and save an entire life. And an old bell on a rooftop can awaken a whole street that has been sleeping inside its fear. And true justice isn't finding someone stronger to clean everything up for us. It is making sure every name is spoken aloud in daylight, so that the next time someone comes knocking at our door, we know we are allowed to say no. If Marlowe's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so we can continue listening together to more compelling stories every day. How did today's story make you feel? What stayed with you the most? Which moment made you stop for just a little while? Please leave a comment below. We truly hope to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish you and your family lasting health, happiness, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.